The morning mist hung heavy over Coral Bay's sleepy harbour when Marcus Kane shoved 70-year-old Elena Rodriguez to the ground outside the corner market. The bag of groceries scattered across the wet pavement as the local drug dealer sneered down at her. "Next time, old woman, keep your mouth shut about what you see." What Marcus didn't know was that Elena's son wasn't just any sailor who'd left home 20 years ago. Captain Darius the Reaper Rodriguez commanded the Dark Tide Pirates, the most ruthless crew to ever sail the Caribbean. His black ships had sunk entire naval fleets. His name was whispered in fear from Port Royal to Tortuga, and his mother's tears were about to cost Marcus everything he'd ever known. When Elena's bloodied letter reached Darius 3 weeks later, something ancient and terrible awakened in the pirate captain's heart. He'd turned his back on his family to pursue treasure and glory, but family blood called louder than gold. The dark tide was coming to Coral Bay, and Marcus Kane had no idea that his days were now numbered in hours, not years. But what happens when a mother's love meets a pirate's vengeance? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elena lay motionless for several heartbeats, her weathered hands scraping against the rough concrete as she tried to push herself upright. A thin line of blood trickled from her split lip where Marcus's ring had caught her. Around them, the few early morning shoppers hurried past, their eyes deliberately averted. In Coral Bay, you learned not to see certain things if you wanted to keep breathing. Marcus adjusted his leather jacket and spat on the ground near her head. "Clean up this mess," he ordered, gesturing at the scattered groceries with his boot. A carton of milk leaked white streams toward the storm drain, mixing with the morning dew and Elena's tears. The old woman's fingers trembled as she reached for a bruised apple that had rolled under a parked car. This wasn't the first time Marcus had made his displeasure known. For months, she'd watched him conduct his business from the shadows of her apartment window overlooking the harbor. Young kids, barely teenagers, would approach his corner with crumpled bills, leaving with small packages that would destroy their futures. She'd reported it to the police twice, but Officer Martinez had made it clear that some problems were better left alone. "Mrs. Rodriguez." Marcus crouched down beside her, his voice dropping to a whisper that chilled her more than the ocean breeze. "You've got exactly one warning left. One. Then me and you are going to have a very different conversation." Elena said nothing, continuing to gather her scattered belongings with shaking hands. Inside her coat pocket, her fingers found the worn photograph she always carried. A young man with dark eyes and his father's stubborn chin, standing proudly beside a fishing boat that seemed impossibly small now. Darius had been barely 18 when he'd kissed her goodbye, promising to return with enough money to fix their leaking roof and pay off her medical bills. That was 20 years ago. The letters had stopped coming 5 years back. Before that, they'd arrived sporadically, always from different ports, always with enough money tucked inside to keep her comfortable, but never enough answers to satisfy a mother's worried heart. She'd heard rumors, whispered stories from sailors who docked in Coral Bay's harbor, stories about a pirate captain who showed no mercy, whose black flags on the horizon meant death for anyone foolish enough to challenge him. But those stories couldn't possibly be about her Darius. Her boy had left to become a fisherman, maybe work on a merchant vessel. The Darius she knew carved wooden boats for the neighborhood children and cried when their old dog died. Marcus stood and walked away without looking back, his heavy footsteps echoing off the wet pavement. Elena watched him disappear around the corner before allowing herself to sob. Not from the physical pain, she'd endured worse when her late husband had been drinking, but from the crushing weight of helplessness that pressed down on her chest like a stone. That evening, Elena sat at her small kitchen table with a pen that kept running out of ink and a piece of stationery she'd been saving for a special occasion. The words came slowly at first, then in a rush that surprised her. She told him about the town, about how it had changed since he'd left, about Marcus and his growing influence, about the fear that kept good people silent, about how she missed having someone to protect her. She didn't mention the blood on her clothes, or the way her ribs ached when she breathed too deeply. Mothers didn't burden their children with such things, even when those children had been gone long enough to become strangers. The letter went out on the morning mail boat, addressed simply to Darius Rodriguez, Caribbean waters. She had no real hope it would find him, but sometimes hope was all you had left when everything else had been stripped away. The emergency room at Millhaven General buzzed with its usual controlled chaos, but for Marcus Kane, the world had narrowed to the small figure lying motionless on the hospital bed. His grandmother's weathered hands, which had once guided him through scraped knees and broken hearts, now lay pale and still against the stark white sheets. 3 broken ribs, a concussion, and internal bleeding, Dr. Patricia Wells explained, her voice professionally gentle. We've stabilized her, but at her age, she didn't need to finish the sentence. The beeping monitors filled the silence with their mechanical anxiety. Marcus nodded, his jaw working silently as he processed the information. To anyone watching, he appeared remarkably calm, just another concerned grandson keeping vigil. They couldn't see the storm brewing behind his dark eyes, the way his fingers unconsciously traced old scars hidden beneath his simple cotton shirt. She's been asking for you, the nurse mentioned as she adjusted the foredrip. Keeps saying something about telling you she's sorry. Sorry? Marcus's voice was barely above a whisper, for not having the grocery money ready. She seems quite distressed about it. The words hit him like a physical blow. Even now, lying broken in a hospital bed, Eleanor Kane was worried about disappointing others. It was so perfectly, heartbreakingly her that Marcus had to step into the hallway to compose himself. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in over a year. Tommy, it's Marcus. I need information on someone named Rick Voss. Thomas Chen had been running the Harbour District's information network since before Marcus left town. If anyone knew the local players, it was Tommy. Marcus Kane. Tommy's voice carried a mix of surprise and wariness. Heard you were back. Also heard you were keeping your head down. Things change. What can you tell me about Voss? Small-time muscle mostly. Works collections for various loan sharks. Runs some street-level dealing. Fancies himself tougher than he is. Tommy paused. Word is he got rough with some old lady today over grocery money. That wouldn't be related to your inquiry, would it? Marcus said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. Look, man, Tommy continued, I know your situation, but Voss isn't working alone. He's connected to the Torino family now. Mickey Torino's been expanding operations since you left. You start something with one of his people. Where does Voss drink? Marcus cut him off. Another pause. The Anchor, usually. Thursday nights. Marcus, I'm telling you, this isn't 3 years ago. You can't just... The line went dead. Back in the hospital room, Eleanor had awakened. Her eyes, clouded with pain medication but still sharp, found Marcus immediately. My boy, she whispered, trying to sit up. Don't move, Grandma. He was beside her in an instant, gently restraining her. Just rest. I'm sorry about the money. I had it, I swear I did, but I gave it to Mrs. Chen for her medication and... Stop. Marcus took her hand carefully, mindful of the bruises. You did nothing wrong. Nothing. She studied his face with the perception that had always unnerved him as a child. I know that look, Marcus. I've seen it before when your father... She gripped his hand with surprising strength. Promise me you won't do anything foolish. Marcus kissed her forehead instead of answering. I'm going to step out and make some calls. About insurance, medical bills. Don't worry about any of that. But Eleanor Kane hadn't raised a fool. She recognized evasion when she heard it. Down in the hospital parking lot, Marcus sat in his weathered pickup truck as the sun set over Millhaven. The town looked peaceful from here, just another small coastal community where nothing much happened. Most people saw it that way because they wanted to, because it was easier than acknowledging the rot that festered in places like the Harbour District. He opened his glove compartment and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside, wrapped in black velvet, lay a ring unlike any other. The band was crafted from silver taken from a Spanish galleon, and set into it was a piece of obsidian carved into the shape of a skull. It had been his father's and his grandfather's before that. Marcus hadn't worn it in 3 years, not since he'd walked away from the life it represented. He'd made a promise to Eleanor and to himself that those days were over. But promises, he reflected as he slipped the ring onto his finger, sometimes had to break to let more important truths through. The weight of it felt familiar, comfortable, like welcoming home an old friend who'd been patiently waiting for your return. Thursday was still 2 days away. That would give him time to prepare, to remember skills he'd deliberately let rust, to contact people he'd hoped never to need again. Rick Voss had no idea what he'd awakened, neither did Mickey Torino, but they would learn soon enough. The rusty anchor hadn't seen this much tension since the hurricane of '98. Word traveled fast in a town like Millhaven, and by evening every soul knew what had happened to Martha Clearwater. The local thugs, who usually held court in the tavern's back corner, found themselves drinking alone, their usual bravado replaced by nervous glances toward the door. Tommy Briggs sat hunched over his third whiskey, his knuckles still tender from the morning's work. The old woman's blood had washed off easy enough, but the satisfaction he'd felt was already curdling into something else. Not regret. Tommy didn't do regret, but a nagging sense that maybe he'd miscalculated. "You hear they brought in some doctor from the county hospital?" whispered Jake Morrison, sliding into the booth across from him. Jake's face was pale, his hands shaking as he lit a cigarette. "So what?" Tommy growled, but his voice lacked its usual edge. "Old Bat probably dies anyway. Natural causes." "Natural causes my ass. Word is she's asking for someone. Keep saying a name over and over." Jake leaned closer, his breath reeking of cheap beer and fear. "Catherine. She keeps calling for Catherine." Tommy's glass stopped halfway to his lips. Every small-town tough knew the stories. Hell, every sailor from here to Port Royal knew the stories. But Catherine Blackwater was legend, myth, the kind of tale drunk pirates told to impress tavern wenches. She couldn't be real. "You're talking fairy tales, Jake?" "Am I?" Jake's cigarette trembled between his fingers. "My cousin works the docks up in Newport. Says there's been strange ships asking questions, ships flying black flags, ships that make grown men wet themselves just looking at them." The tavern door burst open with such violence that the ancient hinges screamed in protest. Every conversation died as a figure stepped through, water dripping from a long black coat despite the cloudless evening outside. The stranger's boots echoed like gunshots on the warped wooden floor. Tommy's blood turned to ice water. The woman was tall, lean as a rapier blade, with silver hair bound in intricate braids, threaded with black ribbons and bone trinkets. Her skin bore the deep tan of someone who'd spent decades under tropical suns, marked with scars that spoke of battles won and enemies left rotting. But it was her eyes that made Tommy's bowels clench. Pale blue like winter seas, cold enough to freeze a man's soul. She surveyed the room with the practiced gaze of a predator, taking in every face, every exit, every potential threat. When those terrible eyes fixed on Tommy's table, he felt his bladder threatening to release. "I'm looking for someone," she said, her voice carrying the refined accent of old money corrupted by years of command. "Someone who thinks it's acceptable to strike defenseless old women." The silence stretched like a noose. Tommy tried to shrink into his booth, but there was nowhere to hide from that glacial stare. Jake had gone white as sailcloth, his cigarette burning down to his fingertips unnoticed. "I've just come from the hospital," the woman continued, stepping closer. Each footfall seemed to echo with the weight of cannon fire. "Martha sends her regards. She's quite the storyteller, that one. Gave me such a detailed description." Tommy's hand crept toward the knife at his belt, but froze when he saw the woman's lips curve into something that might charitably be called a smile. It was the expression of a shark scenting blood. "Thomas Michael Briggs," she said, and hearing his full name from those lips felt like a death sentence being read. 24 years old, born in the charity ward at Millhaven General. Father unknown, mother died of consumption when you were 7. 3 arrests for assault, 2 for theft, 1 for arson that couldn't be proven. How do you— I know many things, Thomas. I know you fancy yourself quite the dangerous man. I know you think strength gives you the right to hurt those who can't fight back. She was at his table now, one scarred hand resting on the wood with deceptive casualness. I also know you're about to soil yourself. She wasn't wrong. Tommy's whole body was trembling, cold sweat beading on his forehead despite the tavern's stuffiness. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was the one people feared in Millhaven. He was the one who made others cower. Martha is 73 years old, the woman said conversationally. She raised me after my own mother died. Fed me, clothed me, loved me when the whole world wanted me dead. She taught me right from wrong, though I admit I've strayed somewhat from her lessons over the years. The woman's hand moved so fast it was barely a blur. One moment she was standing casually by the table, the next, Tommy's head was slammed against the wood hard enough to split his lip, her fingers twisted in his greasy hair like an iron vice. You hurt my mother, Thomas. That presents us with a problem that needs solving. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered planks of the Crimson Vengeance as Captain Marcus Bloodhawk Thorne stood at the bow, his weathered hands gripping the rail with white-knuckled intensity. The salty breeze whipped through his grizzled hair, but his steel-grey eyes remained fixed on the distant shoreline where Millhaven's modest buildings grew larger with each passing moment. Behind him, his crew moved with practiced efficiency, preparing for what they all knew would be more than a simple port call. Word had spread quickly through the ship's belly about their captain's connection to the beaten woman, and every man aboard understood the gravity of their mission. These weren't ordinary pirates seeking treasure or plunder. They were instruments of vengeance sailing toward a reckoning that had been 30 years in the making. "Captain!" called out Finn O'Malley, the ship's first mate, approaching with the cautious respect of a man who'd sailed these treacherous waters for over a decade. "The men are asking about our approach. Do we dock at the main harbor or—" "No." Thorne's voice cut through the morning air like a cutlass through silk. "We anchor in the hidden cove north of town, the one behind Devil's Tooth Rock. I won't have innocent dock workers caught in what's coming." Finn nodded, understanding immediately. The captain's code had always been clear. Civilians stayed clear of pirate business, especially when that business involved settling old scores. "And our target?" Thorne's jaw tightened as he pulled a crumpled piece of parchment from his coat. The hastily scrawled message that had reached him 3 days prior, carried by a merchant vessel whose captain owed him a considerable favor. The words were simple but had ignited a fury that burned hotter than the fires of hell itself. "Tommy Briggs, local muscle for the Kellerman gang, thinks beating defenseless women makes him tough." His voice dropped to a growl that made even the hardened first mate suppress a shiver. He's about to learn the difference between a small-town bully and real violence. As the Crimson Vengeance adjusted course toward the hidden cove, Thorne's mind drifted back to memories he'd buried deep beneath years of salt spray and cannon smoke. Margaret Sullivan, Maggie, with her kind smile and gentle hands that had bandaged his wounds when he was nothing more than a scared boy running from a father's belt. She'd been the lighthouse keeper's daughter then, and he'd been the troublemaker everyone expected would end up dead or in chains before his 18th birthday. She'd proven them all wrong, in her way. Her belief in him had planted the first seeds of the code he now lived by. Honor among thieves, protection for the innocent, and swift justice for those who preyed upon the weak. Even when he'd taken to the seas and embraced the pirate's life, those lessons had remained his moral compass through the darkest storms. The ship's bell chimed as they rounded Devil's Tooth Rock, a jagged outcropping that concealed the narrow entrance to a cove Thorne had discovered in his youth. The natural harbor was invisible from Millhaven proper, making it perfect for their needs. Within minutes, the crew had dropped anchor and begun lowering the boats. "How many men, Captain?" asked Rodrigo Santos, the ship's quartermaster, checking the priming on his pistol with the methodical care of a professional killer. "Just myself and 3 others. This isn't a raid, it's personal business." Thorne selected his weapons with deliberate precision, his father's cutlass worn smooth by decades of use, 2 flintlock pistols, freshly cleaned and loaded, and a wickedly curved dagger that had opened more throats than he cared to count. "Finn, you're with me. Santos, choose one more. Someone reliable. Black Pete's good with a blade, and he knows how to keep his mouth shut," Santos suggested. Thorne nodded approval. Peter "Black Pete" Morrison was a giant of a man whose dark skin bore the ritual scars of his African homeland. He'd been a slave until Thorne's crew had liberated a transport ship 5 years earlier, and his loyalty to the captain was absolute. As the small boat cut through the calm waters toward shore, Thorne felt the familiar weight of impending violence settle over him like a well-worn coat. This wasn't about treasure or territory. This was about family, about debts that transcended blood and gold. Tommy Briggs had made the fatal error of assuming his victims had no one to speak for them, no one to balance the scales. The boat's hull scraped against the rocky shore with a grinding whisper that seemed to echo through the morning stillness. Thorne stepped onto dry land for the first time in months, his boots finding purchase on stones worn smooth by countless tides. Somewhere in the town beyond, a man was going about his morning routine, completely unaware that death itself had just made landfall. The reckoning had begun. The harbour bells tolled midnight as Marcus Thorne stepped onto the weathered planks of Ravenscove's main dock. Behind him, the Crimson Vengeance sat anchored in the deeper waters like a sleeping predator, her black sails furled and cannons gleaming in the moonlight. The skeleton crew he'd left aboard knew their orders: maintain watch and be ready for a swift departure. The town sprawled before him, a collection of ramshackle buildings and narrow streets that reeked of fish, tar, and desperation. Perfect hunting grounds for the kind of scum he sought. Marcus had changed from his captain's coat into simpler garb, dark leather vest, worn boots, and a tricorn hat pulled low over his scarred features. To any observer, he appeared to be just another seafaring man seeking drink and company after weeks at sea. But the cutlass at his hip and the twin pistols crossed over his chest told a different story to those who knew how to read such signs. Marcus made his way through the twisting streets, his boots echoing off cobblestones slick with sea spray and something less pleasant. Taverns lined the main thoroughfare, their windows glowing amber in the darkness, raucous laughter and off-key singing spilling into the night air. He passed the sirens called Dead Man's Rest and the Broken Anchor, each establishment more decrepit than the last. It was at the 4th tavern, the Bloody Cutlass, that he found what he was looking for. The establishment squatted at the intersection of 2 narrow alleys like a tumor, its walls stained black with years of grime and its windows so grimy they barely let light escape. The perfect sort of place where questions weren't asked and memories grew conveniently short when coin changed hands. Marcus pushed through the heavy oak door and stepped into a cloud of tobacco smoke and unwashed bodies. The tavern's interior matched its exterior, low ceiling blackened with soot, tables scarred from countless knife fights, and a clientele that looked as though they'd crawl back under rocks at the first sign of dawn. He approached the bar where a mountain of a man with arms like ship masts served watered-down rum from bottles that had seen better decades. The bartender's eyes narrowed as Marcus settled onto a creaking stool. "What'll it be, stranger?" "Your finest rum," Marcus said, placing a silver coin on the scarred wood. "And information." The bartender's thick fingers closed over the coin with practiced speed. "Information costs extra." Marcus produced another coin, this one gold. "I'm looking for a man named Jake Hewitt, small-time muscle, fond of hitting those who can't hit back." "Jake's got a lot of enemies," the bartender said carefully. "What's your business with him?" "The permanent kind." The words hung in the smoky air between them. The bartender studied Marcus more closely, taking in the quality of his weapons, the confident way he held himself, the coldness in his dark eyes. This was no ordinary sailor seeking revenge over a bar fight or unpaid debt. "He'll be here," the bartender said finally. "Comes in most nights around this time with his crew. Usually sits in the back corner where he can watch the door." Marcus nodded, and took his rum to an empty table along the far wall. The liquor was indeed watered down, but he barely tasted it. His attention was focused on the door, cataloguing each face that entered. Cutthroats, thieves, smugglers, the usual denizens of such establishments. Men who lived violent lives and met violent ends, their passing mourned by no one. An hour passed, then another. Marcus remained motionless as a statue, the rum untouched before him, his presence gradually fading into the tavern's shadows, as other patrons forgot about the quiet stranger in the corner. It was nearly 2 in the morning when Jake Hewitt finally arrived. Marcus recognized him instantly from the description provided by his network of informants. Medium height, stocky build, with a kind of face that suggested cruelty came naturally to him. A jagged scar ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, probably a gift from someone who'd fought back. He was flanked by 3 other men, each one radiating the casual menace of those accustomed to taking what they wanted through force. Jake's group claimed a table near the back, just as the bartender had predicted. They ordered drinks and began the kind of loud, crude conversation that marked them as men drunk on their own perceived power. Marcus listened to their boasts about recent scores, their casual discussion of violence inflicted on the innocent, their plans for future cruelties. With each word, the rage that had brought Marcus to this place crystallized into something harder and colder than winter steel. These weren't just criminals. They were predators who preyed on the defenseless, who struck down elderly women for sport and thought themselves untouchable. Marcus Thorne, terror of the 7 seas, was about to teach them exactly how wrong they were. He stood slowly, his hand resting casually on his cutlass hilt, and began walking toward their table. The morning sun cast long shadows across the harbor as Marcus Kane stepped onto the weathered planks of the dock. His weathered boots made no sound despite the creaking wood beneath him. Behind him, 3 of his most trusted crew members followed at a respectful distance. Briggs, a mountain of a man, with arms like tree trunks. Elena, whose delicate appearance masked a deadly proficiency with blades. And old Tom, whose scarred face told stories of 100 battles. Kane's reputation preceded him through every port town along the coast. But here in Millbrook Harbor, he was just another sailor to the untrained eye. His dark coat hung loose, concealing the arsenal beneath, and his graying hair was tied back in a simple queue. Only his eyes betrayed the storm brewing within, pale blue and cold as Arctic ice. The harbour master, a nervous man named Finch, approached with clipboard in hand and sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Word had already spread about who owned the ship that had anchored just beyond the breakwater. "Captain, sir," Finch stammered, his voice barely steady. "Will you be requiring provisions? Fresh water? We have the finest—" Kane's gaze swept past him toward the town proper, where morning smoke rose from chimneys and early merchants were opening their shops. Somewhere in those winding streets lived the man who had struck Martha Whitmore. Somewhere close, Tommy Russo was going about his morning routine, unaware that death itself had come calling. "Information," Kane said quietly, his voice carrying despite its low volume. "I need information about a local man, Tommy Russo." Finch's complexion went from pale to ashen. Everyone in Millbrook knew Tommy Russo, knew his reputation, his connections, and, most importantly, knew to stay clear of him. The fact that someone was asking questions about Tommy, especially someone like the man standing before him, meant trouble was brewing. I don't know much about local affairs, Captain. Perhaps you'd want to speak with—" "Perhaps," Kane interrupted, his tone unchanged but somehow more menacing, "you'd want to reconsider what you know." Briggs stepped forward slightly, and Finch's eyes darted between the massive sailor and the captain. Sweat was now flowing freely down his face. "Tommy runs with Eddie Castellano's crew," Finch said quickly. "Has a temper, drinks too much, causes trouble, lives above Murphy's Tavern on Dock Street. But Captain, if you're thinking of making waves, Castellano has connections that reach—" "Castellano." Kane tasted the name, filing it away. One thread often led to another in his experience. And if Tommy Russo was merely a symptom of a larger disease, then perhaps the cure would require a more comprehensive approach. Elena moved to Kane's left shoulder, her dark eyes scanning the growing crowd of dock workers and merchants who were pretending not to watch their conversation. "Locals are nervous, Captain. Word's spreading fast." Kane nodded slightly. In a town this size, the arrival of the Crimson Revenge would be the biggest news in months. By noon, everyone would know he was here. By evening, theories about why would be flying through every tavern and shop. He preferred to work before speculation became preparation. "Tell me about Martha Whitmore," he said to Finch, whose confusion was evident. "Old Martha, sweet woman, runs the bakery with her granddaughter, feeds half the poor kids in town from her own pocket." "Why would you—" Understanding dawned in Finch's eyes. Oh, God. Tommy hit Martha. It wasn't a question. Kane's presence had provided the missing piece to what must have been circulating gossip about an incident. Finch took an involuntary step backward. "When?" Kane asked. 3 days ago, outside her shop. Tommy was drunk, angry about something. Martha tried to calm him down when he was shouting at some kids. He backhanded her right in the street. Finch's voice grew stronger with indignation, knocked her clean down. Might have killed her if Doc Peterson hadn't been right there. Old Tom spat into the harbor water. "Where's your law in this town?" "Sheriff's bought," Finch said bitterly. "Castellano's money reaches everywhere." Tommy walked away laughing, while Martha bled on the cobblestones. Kane was quiet for a long moment, watching the town come alive with morning activity. Somewhere beyond those buildings, an old woman was probably struggling with her injuries, her faith in human decency shaken. Somewhere else, Tommy Russo was starting another day, unpunished and unrepentant. "The tavern," Kane said finally. "Murphy's on Dock Street." "Yes, sir. But Captain, Castellano's got men—" Kane was already walking away, his crew falling into formation around him. Behind them, Finch watched with the growing certainty that before the day was through, Millbrook Harbor would never be quite the same again. The hunt had begun, and Captain Marcus Kane always finished what he started. The morning fog clung to Millbrook's harbor like a shroud, but Captain Blackwater could see through it as if it were glass. 20 years of navigating treacherous waters had given him eyes that could pierce any veil nature threw his way. He stood at the bow of the Crimson Revenge, his weathered hands gripping the rail as the town's shabby docks materialized through the mist. "Drop anchor here," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "We go ashore quietly." His first mate, Torres, approached with cautious steps. The crew had learned long ago to read their captain's moods, and this particular storm brewing behind Blackwater's steel-grey eyes promised devastation for whoever had earned his ire. "Captain, the men are asking—" "The men will know what they need to know when I decide they need to know it." Blackwater's tone could have frozen the morning air solid. "Lower the boats. Bring only those who can move like shadows and strike like lightning." Within minutes, 3 small boats cut through the gentle swells toward shore, their occupants moving with practiced silence. Blackwater had chosen his landing party carefully, Torres for his unwavering loyalty, Scarface Jim for his ability to extract information from stone statues, and 6 others whose reputations for violence preceded them into every port from here to Port Royal. The docks were nearly deserted at this early hour, save for a few fishermen preparing their nets. One old salt looked up as the strangers approached, his eyes widening at the sight of Blackwater's distinctive coat and the cutlass hanging at his side. The fisherman quickly averted his gaze and busied himself with his work, understanding instinctively that some men were best left unnoticed. Blackwater's boots echoed against the weathered planks as he strode toward the town proper. His mind burned with the image of Martha lying broken in that hospital bed, her gentle hands bandaged, her kind eyes clouded with pain she didn't deserve. The woman who had sung him lullabies when storms raged, who had patched his scraped knees and fed him when his own mother couldn't, reduced to a victim by some worthless piece of human refuse. "Sir," Torres ventured as they reached the end of the dock, "perhaps we should—" Blackwater's raised hand cut him off mid-sentence. The captain had spotted something that made his blood run cold with rage. An elderly woman struggling to carry her market basket, moving with the careful, painful steps of someone nursing fresh injuries. He approached her with surprising gentleness, his voice softening to barely above a whisper. "Excuse me, ma'am, are you hurt?" The woman looked up, startled by the concern in his tone despite his fearsome appearance. "Oh, it's nothing, dear. Just had a bit of trouble yesterday with some young ruffian. These old bones don't bounce back like they used to." What did this man look like? Something in Blackwater's question made the woman study his face more carefully. She saw controlled fury there, but also genuine care that reminded her of her own grandson. Tall fellow, maybe 25 or so. Had a scar running down his left cheek and wore a red bandana. Goes by the name Tommy Crenshaw, though most folks just call him Scar Tommy. Hangs around Murphy's Tavern most days, causing trouble for decent folk. Blackwater's jaw tightened. Another innocent, another victim of the same animal who had hurt Martha. The pattern was becoming clear, and it sickened him. "Thank you for telling me," he said, pressing a gold coin into her weathered palm. "Buy yourself something nice, and stay off the streets today. There's likely to be some unpleasantness." The woman's eyes widened at the generous gift, then narrowed with understanding. "You be careful now, young man. Tommy runs with a rough crowd and they don't fight fair." A smile touched Blackwater's lips, though it held no warmth. "Neither do I." As they walked toward the town center, Torres fell into step beside his captain. "Murphy's Tavern." "Murphy's Tavern," Blackwater confirmed. "But first, we gather intelligence. I want to know everything about this Tommy Crenshaw. Where he lives, who his friends are, what he fears. When I'm done with him, I want him to understand exactly why he's dying." The crew spread out through Millbrook's narrow streets like shadows, each man beginning the deadly work of surveillance. Blackwater himself took position across from Murphy's Tavern, settling into a doorway that offered clear sightlines while keeping him hidden from casual observation. The fog was beginning to lift, revealing a town that looked peaceful enough on the surface, but Blackwater knew that beneath every quiet community lay currents of violence and cruelty. Men like Tommy Crenshaw were parasites, feeding on the weak and defenseless until someone stronger came along to crush them. Today, that someone had arrived. He touched the worn locket hanging beneath his shirt, feeling Martha's photograph through the metal. Soon, he promised silently, soon justice would be served, pirate style. The morning sun cast long shadows across the docks as Marcus Sullivan stood at the helm of his fishing boat, watching the horizon with growing unease. Word had spread through Millbrook like wildfire. Strangers were asking questions, and they weren't the kind of people who accepted no for an answer. He'd heard about what happened to Tommy Chen's crew. 3 of them found unconscious in the warehouse district, their memories conveniently fuzzy about who had visited them. The 4th man, Billy Reeves, had simply vanished. His girlfriend reported him missing, but everyone knew better than to dig too deep when people started disappearing in their line of work. Marcus wasn't a violent man by nature. He'd fallen into Eddie Kowalski's crew more out of desperation than ambition. A fishing boat didn't pay the bills when the fish weren't biting, and his daughter needed surgery he couldn't afford. But the old woman, that had been Eddie's doing, not his. He'd told Eddie to leave her alone, but Eddie never listened to anyone. Now Marcus found himself checking over his shoulder every few minutes, jumping at shadows. The smart thing would be to take his boat out to sea and keep going until he hit international waters. Let Eddie and the others deal with whatever storm was coming. A soft whistle echoed across the water, the melody hauntingly familiar. Marcus froze, his hands gripping the wheel tighter. He knew that tune. Every sailor worth his salt did. It was an old shanty, one that hadn't been heard in these waters for years, the kind of song that made experienced captains change course and pray they hadn't been noticed. Beautiful morning, isn't it? Marcus spun around to find a woman standing on his deck. She was tall and lean, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical braid. Her clothes were simple, dark pants, a white shirt, and a long coat that had seen better days, But her eyes were the color of a storm-tossed sea, and they seemed to look right through him. How did you—" Marcus stammered, glancing at the gangplank he was certain had been empty moments before. "You're Marcus Sullivan," she said, not bothering to answer his question. "You were there when Eddie Kowalski struck down Eleanor Winters." It wasn't a question. Marcus felt his mouth go dry. "Look, I don't know who you are, but—" "My name is Captain Sarah Blackwater," she said quietly, "and Eleanor Winters is my mother." The blood drained from Marcus's face. Every sailor knew that name, whispered in taverns from Port Royal to Singapore. Stories of ships found drifting empty, their crews vanished without a trace. Tales of a woman who could command the seas themselves, who showed no mercy to those who crossed her. Most people assumed they were just stories, legends meant to frighten children and green sailors. Marcus realized with growing horror that they weren't legends at all. "I didn't touch her," he said quickly, raising his hands. "That was all Eddie. I told him to leave her alone, but he wouldn't listen. She was just defending that kid, and Eddie—" He lost his temper. "Yes," Captain Blackwater said, stepping closer. "I know, which is why you're still breathing." She moved to the railing, gazing out at the harbor with the casual ease of someone completely in control. "You have a daughter, don't you? 8 years old, surgery for a heart condition." Marcus's protective instincts flared. "You leave her out of this. She's got nothing to do with—" "Peace, Mr. Sullivan. I'm not in the habit of threatening children." Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to command. "In fact, I'm prepared to be quite generous. There's an envelope in your wheelhouse, enough money to pay for your daughter's surgery and set your family up comfortably for years to come." Marcus stared at her, confusion mixing with his fear. "What's the catch?" "No catch. Consider it payment for services rendered." She turned to face him, and he saw something almost human flicker in those cold eyes. "You showed my mother kindness in a place where kindness is rare. You tried to stop what happened. That means something. But I need to know where Eddie is, and I need to know about his other associates, the ones who weren't at the warehouse that night." Marcus hesitated. Talking was a death sentence in their world, but looking at Captain Blackwater, he realized that not talking might be worse. Besides, Eddie had brought this down on all of them. The man's cruelty had finally caught up with him. "Eddie's got a safe house," Marcus said slowly. "Old cannery on the north side of town. He's probably holed up there with Jake Morrison and Tommy's cousin, Pete." Captain Blackwater nodded, seeming unsurprised. "How many others?" "Maybe 3 or 4 more. Small-timers mostly, but they're loyal to Eddie and scared enough to fight." "Fear makes people dangerous," she agreed, "but it also makes them predictable." She moved toward the gangplank with fluid grace. "Take your daughter somewhere nice, Mr. Sullivan. Somewhere far from here. And when people ask what happened to Eddie Kowalski and his crew, tell them the sea claimed them. What if they don't believe me?" Captain Blackwater smiled, and Marcus felt his blood turn to ice water. "They will." The harbourmaster's office reeked of stale tobacco and fear sweat when Marcus Kane finally decided to talk. Blood trickled from his split lip as he slumped in the wooden chair, his earlier bravado completely shattered after witnessing what Captain Blackwater had done to his 2 remaining men. She was just supposed to hand over the coins," Marcus wheezed, avoiding the pirate's cold stare. Old woman was clutching her purse like it held the crown jewels. Tommy said to grab it, but she wouldn't let go. Blackwater stood perfectly still by the window, silhouetted against the dying afternoon light. The screams from the docks had finally stopped, but the metallic scent of blood still hung heavy in the salt air. "Continue." "I didn't mean to hit her so hard, she fell wrong." Marcus's voice cracked. "We took what we could and ran." "That's it. That's all of it." "The woman's name?" I don't know. Some local. We'd been watching the market, picking easy marks." Marcus flinched as Blackwater turned from the window. "Captain, I swear on my mother's grave, if I'd known she meant something to you—" The cutlass whispered from its sheath, the blade catching the last rays of sunlight. Her name was Constance Hartwell. She baked bread for hungry sailors and mended torn sails without asking for payment. She never harmed a soul in her 73 years. Blackwater's voice carried the weight of grinding millstones. You killed her for 17 copper pieces. Marcus pressed himself back against the chair. Look, we can work something out. I know where Tommy's been hiding the rest of our take. Split it 50-50 and we forget this whole... The blade moved faster than a striking snake. Marcus's words died in a gurgling gasp as steel found the soft flesh of his throat. His eyes went wide, hands clawing uselessly at the spreading crimson. Blackwater held the cutlass steady until the light faded from the thug's eyes, then withdrew the blade with practiced efficiency. Outside, the Crimson Tide's crew had finished their grim work. Bodies floated face down in the harbour, while others decorated the dock pilings like macabre scarecrows. Any soul foolish enough to associate with Marcus Kane's gang had paid the ultimate price. Blackwater had made his point clear to anyone watching from behind shuttered windows. Some debts could never be negotiated. The captain emerged from the harbour master's office just as First Mate Rodriguez approached, wiping blood from his boarding axe. It's done, Captain. Every last one of them. And the witnesses? Scattered to the four winds. Half the towns barricaded themselves indoors. Rodriguez glanced at the carnage surrounding them. Word of this will spread fast. The name Blackwater will carry even more weight in these waters. The captain nodded grimly. There was no satisfaction in the slaughter, only the cold completion of a necessary task. Constance Hartwell had shown him kindness when the rest of the world saw only a dangerous pirate. She'd pressed warm loaves into his hands and asked nothing in return except that he stay safe on dark waters. Her death demanded payment in full. "Burn their ship," Blackwater commanded, gesturing toward the ramshackle vessel moored at the far end of the dock. "Leave nothing but ash and memory." As his crew set about their task, Blackwater walked alone to the small cottage where Constance had lived. The door hung open, revealing the chaos left by Marcus's men. Furniture lay overturned, belongings scattered across the floor like autumn leaves. They'd ransacked the place looking for more coins that didn't exist. In the kitchen, flour still dusted the wooden table where she'd been preparing tomorrow's bread. Blackwater ran his fingers through the fine powder, remembering her gentle hands kneading dough while she hummed old sea shanties. She'd known exactly who he was. The stories of his exploits were legend from here to Port Royal, yet she'd treated him like a favoured grandson returning from a long voyage. The sound of crackling flames drew his attention back to the harbour. Orange tongues licked hungrily at the brigantine's tarred hull, while thick black smoke billowed into the evening sky. Soon there would be nothing left of Marcus Kane and his crew except charred wood and bitter memory. Blackwater closed the cottage door gently behind him and made his way back to the Crimson Tide. His crew had already begun preparing for departure, coiling lines and checking rigging with efficient precision. They knew better than to disturb their captain's brooding silence. As the pirate ship eased away from the blood-stained docks, Blackwater stood at the stern rail, watching the town recede into gathering darkness. Constance Hartwell's debt had been paid in full, but the hollow ache in his chest suggested that some wounds cut too deep for mere vengeance to heal. The open ocean called, promising fresh horizons and new quarry. There would always be another score to settle, another wrong to right in his own brutal fashion. The storm had passed, leaving behind an eerie calm that stretched across the harbour like a held breath. Captain Blackwater stood at the bow of the Crimson Revenge, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he surveyed the town that had dared harm his beloved Nana Macready. The morning mist clung to the water, but through it he could see the frantic activity on the docks as townsfolk scrambled to prepare defences they knew would prove useless. Marcus Thorne paced the length of the harbour-master's office, his boots echoing against the wooden floor as sweat beaded on his forehead. Through the salt-stained windows, he watched his men positioning makeshift barricades and checking their weapons with trembling hands. The sight of the infamous pirate ship anchored just beyond the breakwater had turned his blood to ice. "Maybe we can negotiate," stammered Deputy Collins, his voice cracking like a boy's. "Offer him compensation, make this right somehow." Thorne whirled on him, eyes blazing with desperate fury. "You think that devil out there wants our coin? He's here for blood, you fool. My blood." He slammed his fist against the window frame, rattling the glass, all because of that worthless old crone. On the Crimson Revenge, Blackwater's crew moved with practiced efficiency, preparing for what they knew would be less a battle than an execution. Cutlasses gleamed in the pale sunlight as they were sharpened to razor edges. Pistols were loaded with particular care, each ball blessed by the ship's cook with words in a language older than memory. First Mate Sullivan approached his captain, a grim smile playing at the corners of his scarred mouth. "The lads are ready, Captain. Word's already spread through the town about what that snake did to the old woman. Half the decent folk are barricaded in their homes, wanting no part of what's coming." Blackwater nodded slowly, his steel-grey eyes never leaving the shore. "Good. This isn't about them. This is about justice for a woman who never hurt a soul in her 70 years. His voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "And it's about teaching this cesspit of a town what happens when they harbour vermin who prey on the innocent." In her small cottage overlooking the harbour, Nana Macready sat in her rocking chair despite the protests of Dr. Brennan, who had insisted she remain bedridden. The left side of her face bore the purple and yellow evidence of Thorne's brutality, but her eyes remained sharp and alert as she watched the drama unfold below. "You should be resting, Eleanor," the doctor fretted, adjusting the bandage around her ribs. "That monster cracked 2 of them, and at your age—" "At my age," she interrupted gently, "I've earned the right to witness justice being served. Besides, someone needs to make sure my boy doesn't get too carried away down there." A young woman burst into the cottage without knocking, her face flushed from running. "Nana Macready, they're saying Captain Blackwater is your son. Is it true?" Eleanor's weathered hand reached up to touch a small locket at her throat, one that held the portrait of a dark-haired boy with defiant eyes. "In every way that matters, child. In every way that matters." Back on the docks, Thorne's men had taken positions behind overturned carts and stacked barrels, their faces pale as they watched the longboats being lowered from the pirate ship. The sound of creaking ropes and splashing oars carried clearly across the water, along with something far more terrifying, the low, rhythmic chanting of the pirate crew as they prepared for war. "Sir," called Sergeant Hayes, his voice barely steady, "maybe we should consider surrender. There's got to be 20 boats heading this way, and we all know Blackwater's reputation." "Surrender?" Thorne's laugh held no humour, only the bitter edge of a man with nothing left to lose. "You think he'll show mercy to any of us after what I did? We fight, or we die like dogs. At least this way we might take some of the bastards with us." The first longboat scraped against the dock with a sound like grinding teeth. Captain Blackwater stepped onto the weathered planks with fluid grace, his long coat billowing behind him like the wings of some dark angel of vengeance. Behind him came Sullivan and the boarding party, each man chosen for his skill with blade and pistol. The morning air thrummed with tension as the 2 forces faced each other across 30 yards of empty dock space. Seagulls cried overhead, their harsh voices the only sound breaking the silence that stretched between honor and corruption, between justice and brutality. Thorne stepped out from behind his barricade, hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Blackwater, let's end this like men." The pirate captain's smile was colder than winter sea spray. "Men?" he called back, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "I see only one man here, Thorne. The rest are cowards who follow a dog who strikes defenseless old women." The salt-crusted warehouse loomed against the storm clouds, its corrugated walls streaked with rust and decades of neglect. Marcus crouched behind a stack of rotting crates, rain drumming against the metal roof above like distant gunfire. Through a grimy window he could see shadows moving inside, at least 6 figures, maybe more. His phone buzzed. A text from Tommy. "Cops bought the story. You got maybe 30 minutes before they figure out the real location. Marcus pocketed the device and checked his weapons one final time. The curved blade at his hip felt familiar, comforting even. He'd taken it from a rival captain years ago, back when territorial disputes were settled with steel instead of lawyers and bribes. Tonight, it would taste blood again. The warehouse's main entrance faced the harbor, but Marcus had spotted a rusted fire escape on the building's north side during his reconnaissance. He moved like smoke between the shadows, each footstep calculated to avoid the scattered debris that could betray his presence. The metal ladder groaned softly under his weight, but the storm's fury masked the sound. A ventilation grate near the roof provided his entry point. The screws had been loosened by years of coastal weather, and Marcus worked them free with the tip of his knife. He dropped into the darkness, landing cat-like on a catwalk 20 feet above the warehouse floor. Below him, Jimmy Castellano paced like a caged animal between towers of shipping containers. The punk's face was flushed, his movements jerky with nervous energy. 3 of his crew lounged nearby, playing cards on an overturned crate, while 2 more stood guard near the entrance. All of them armed, all of them jumpy. "Where the hell is everyone?" Jimmy snapped. Rico should have been back by now. "And what about the others?" One of the card players, a heavy-set man with prison tattoos covering his neck, glanced up. "Probably got held up by the storm, boss. You know how it is." Marcus smiled grimly. The storm had nothing to do with their absence. By now, Rico and the others were either dead or bound in the basement of the Sea Serpent, learning what happened to those who threatened Eleanor Grimsby. But Jimmy didn't need to know that. Not yet. Moving with practiced silence, Marcus made his way along the catwalk toward the warehouse's power junction. The electrical box hung from the wall like a metal growth, its door secured with a simple padlock. Another few seconds with his knife, and the warehouse plunged into absolute darkness. "What the—" Jimmy's voice cracked. "Get the lights back on." "Must be the storm," someone called out. Flashlight beams began cutting through the blackness, dancing frantically across the warehouse interior. Marcus dropped from the catwalk, using a shipping container to break his fall. The sound was barely audible above the thunder, but one of the guards turned in his direction. The man's flashlight beam swept toward Marcus's position, and for a moment their eyes met across the darkness. The guard opened his mouth to shout a warning, but Marcus's blade found his throat first. The man crumpled silently, his flashlight spinning across the concrete floor before going dark. "Vinny?" Jimmy called out. "Where'd your light go?" Chaos erupted as the remaining crew members realized something was wrong. Flashlights swung wildly in all directions, creating a disorienting strobe effect. Marcus used the confusion to his advantage, moving between the containers like a wraith. The second guard died before he could draw his weapon. Marcus came at him from behind, one hand clamping over his mouth while the blade slid between his ribs. The man's pistol clattered to the floor, the sound echoing through the warehouse like a death knell. "Someone's in here." The heavyweight with the neck tattoos was on his feet now, fumbling for his gun. "Jimmy, we need to—" A throwing knife sprouted from his chest, the blade punching through his sternum with surgical precision. He stared down at it in disbelief before toppling backward onto the card table. Now it was just Jimmy and 2 others, their flashlights forming a desperate circle of light in the vast darkness. Marcus could smell their fear, sharp and acrid beneath the warehouse's musty air. "Show yourself!" Jimmy screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. "Come on, you coward! Face me!" Marcus obliged, stepping into their circle of light like a nightmare made flesh. Blood spattered his clothes, and his eyes held the cold promise of death. The 2 remaining crew members took one look at him and ran, their footsteps echoing as they fled toward the entrance. He let them go. They weren't important. Only Jimmy mattered now. Jimmy, who had raised his hand against an innocent woman who had signed his own death warrant with that single act of cruelty. "You," Jimmy whispered, recognizing him at last. His hand shook as he raised his gun. "You're supposed to be dead. We killed you on that boat." Marcus's smile was winter cold. "You killed Marcus Delacroix, the businessman," he said, his voice carrying the authority of rolling thunder. But some things refused to stay buried. The storm had passed, leaving Millhaven's harbour shrouded in an eerie calm. Captain Blackwater stood at the bow of the Crimson Revenge, her weathered hands gripping the rail as she surveyed the town that had harboured her grandmother's attacker. The moonlight cast long shadows across the dock, where a handful of Marcus Vale's remaining men huddled behind overturned crates and shipping containers. "They're scared, Captain," Finn observed, lowering his spyglass. Half of Vale's crew abandoned ship when word spread about what happened to his lieutenant. Blackwater's lips curved into a predatory smile. "Fear is a useful currency, but it won't settle this debt." She turned to address her assembled crew. "Remember, we're not here for plunder. This is about justice. Vale dies tonight, and anyone fool enough to stand with him shares his fate." The pirates moved with practiced silence, their boots barely whispering against the wet planks as they disembarked. Years of midnight raids had taught them the art of becoming one with the shadows. Blackwater led the advance, her twin cutlasses gleaming in the pale light. The first sentry never saw death coming. Magnus's massive hands closed around the man's throat, silencing him before he could raise an alarm. They dragged the body behind a stack of cargo nets and continued their advance toward the warehouse district where Vale had made his temporary stronghold. But as they approached the main building, Blackwater raised her fist, the signal to halt. Something was wrong. The windows were too bright, too many figures moving inside. She could hear voices, far more than the scattered remnants of Vale's gang should account for. "It's a trap," she whispered to Finn. "That bastard called in reinforcements." Through the grimy windows, they could see at least 24 armed men. Vale had clearly reached out to every criminal contact in the region, promising them shares of some imaginary treasure if they helped him survive the night. What he hadn't told them was that they were facing the most notorious pirate crew in recent memory. "New plan," Blackwater announced quietly. "Torch, take half the crew and circle around to the back. When you hear my signal, burn everything that isn't made of stone. We're going to smoke these rats out." As her men dispersed into the darkness, Blackwater felt the familiar rush of impending battle surge through her veins. This was what she lived for. Not just the violence, but the chess game of tactics and timing that preceded it. Vale thought he was clever, gathering numbers to his cause, but he'd made a crucial error. He'd trapped himself inside a wooden building with only 2 exits. The minutes crawled by until Torch's signal, a brief flash of lantern light, confirmed his team was in position. Blackwater drew both cutlasses and stepped into the open courtyard before the warehouse. "Marcus Vale!" Her voice boomed across the silent harbour. "You struck an innocent woman. You hurt my blood. Come out and face me or I'll burn this place down around your ears." The response came in the form of gunfire. Muzzle flashes lit up the windows as Vale's hired guns opened fire. Blackwater rolled behind a water barrel as bullets whined overhead, then gave her own signal. 3 sharp whistles that cut through the chaos. Torch's incendiary arrows found their marks almost instantly. The back wall of the warehouse erupted in flames that spread with supernatural speed thanks to the oil-soaked rags tied to each shaft. Panic erupted inside as smoke began billowing through the structure. The front door burst open and men poured out, coughing and stumbling. They found themselves facing the business ends of a dozen pirate weapons. Some tried to fight, others attempted to flee, but Blackwater's crew had positioned themselves perfectly. The courtyard became a killing ground. Through the smoke and confusion, Blackwater spotted her true target. Vale emerged from a side window, his expensive coat singed and his face streaked with soot. He clutched an ornate pistol in one hand and a cloth-wrapped bundle in the other. "There's my cowardly rat," she snarled, pursuing him as he bolted toward the harbour. Vale's desperation lent him speed, but Blackwater had been running down prey across ship decks and Caribbean beaches for decades. She gained ground with each stride, her cutlasses singing through the salt air. He spun at the end of the pier, cornered between the water and certain death. "Wait!" he gasped, holding up the bundle. "I have something you want. Information about your grandmother. about who really ordered the attack. Blackwater's advance slowed, but her weapons remained raised. "The only thing I want from you is your last breath." "She was asking questions," Vale babbled, backing toward the edge, about old shipping records, old crimes. Someone wanted her silenced permanently. The confession hung in the air between them like smoke from the burning warehouse. Blackwater's eyes narrowed as the implications crashed over her like a rogue wave. The warehouse district lay shrouded in pre-dawn mist as Captain Bloodworth's forces moved like ghosts through the narrow alleys. Marcus had chosen his stronghold well. Converted shipping containers, stacked 3 high, formed a maze of corridors and elevated platforms, creating multiple choke points and escape routes. But the pirate captain had spent decades navigating treacherous waters, and concrete jungles were no different from coral reefs. Serafina crouched beside him on the fire escape, overlooking the compound's eastern entrance. Her fingers traced the edge of her throwing knife as she counted the sentries. 4 guards visible, probably twice that number inside. Motion sensors on the main gates, but the containers create blind spots. Marcus always was paranoid, Bloodworth murmured, studying the layout through his spyglass. "See that stack on the north side? That's where he'll be holed up. Highest point, 3 exit routes, and enough steel between him and trouble to stop a cannonball." Below them, Finn emerged from the shadows, giving the all-clear signal. The young sailor had spent the last hour disabling the perimeter alarms with the practiced ease of someone who'd cut more than his share of rigging in stormy weather. The captain's radio crackled softly. "Bosun's in position at the south entrance," came Davy's gravelly whisper. "Tommy's got the vehicles blocked at the west gate. We're ready to make some noise." Bloodworth's hand instinctively moved to the locket containing Eleanor's photograph. The elderly woman's kind face had haunted his dreams for weeks. A broken body, a stark reminder of the innocence that evil men destroyed without thought. Tonight, that debt would be paid in full. "Remember," he spoke into the radio, "Marcus is mine, but I want every one of his lieutenants to face judgment for their crimes. No mercy for those who prey on the defenseless." The assault began with surgical precision. Serafina's knives found their marks in darkness, dropping 2 sentries before they could cry out. Finn scaled the container wall like a spider, his footsteps silent on the corrugated metal. The guards never knew death was coming until it was too late. Davy's crew hit the southern entrance with controlled fury, their coordinated advance clearing room after room with military efficiency. These weren't random street thugs. They were seasoned warriors who'd faced down naval destroyers and lived to tell the tale. The first gunshots echoed through the warehouse complex as Marcus's men realized they were under attack. Muzzle flashes lit up the container corridors like lightning in a storm, and the sharp crack of automatic weapons replaced the morning silence. Bloodworth moved through the chaos with deadly purpose, his cutlass singing as it carved through opposition. A young punk with gold teeth tried to ambush him from behind a shipping container, only to discover that the pirate captain's reflexes were honed by decades of life-or-death combat. The blade found its mark between the man's ribs before he could pull the trigger. "Marcus!" Bloodworth's voice boomed across the compound. "Face me, you coward! Come and answer for what you've done!" The response came in the form of sustained gunfire from the elevated container fortress. Bullets sparked off metal walls as Marcus's remaining forces made their desperate stand. But the pirate crew pressed forward relentlessly, their advance inexorable as a rising tide. Serafina appeared at Bloodworth's side, blood speckling her dark clothing. "North and east sides are clear. Davies has the south locked down. Tommy's reporting 2 vehicles tried to break through the western perimeter. They didn't make it." The captain nodded grimly. "Then it's time to finish this." They fought their way up the makeshift fortress, using shipping containers as cover while Marcus's men rained death from above. The confined spaces turned every corner into a potential killing ground, but Bloodworth's crew had faced worse odds in the cramped gun decks of enemy vessels. When they finally reached the top level, they found Marcus waiting in what had once been a luxury shipping container converted into an office. The crime boss stood behind an ornate desk, a gold-plated pistol in his trembling hands. His expensive suit was rumpled, his slicked-back hair disheveled, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "You're him," Marcus stammered, recognition dawning in his eyes. "The pirate they call Bloodworth. But this is impossible. You're supposed to be a myth." "Myths don't bleed," the captain replied, advancing slowly. "But you will." "Wait." Marcus raised his free hand. "Whatever they're paying you, I'll double it, triple it. That old woman was nothing, a nobody. Why throw your life away for—" The words died in his throat as Bloodworth's eyes blazed with cold fire. Her name was Eleanor Whitmore. She was a retired teacher who spent 40 years shaping young minds. She volunteered at the animal shelter every weekend and never missed Sunday service. "She was worth 1,000 of you." Marcus's finger tightened on the trigger, but he was too slow. The pirate captain's blade was already in motion, gleaming like justice itself in the fluorescent light. The warehouse district lay shrouded in pre-dawn mist when Captain Blackwater and his crew made their final approach. 3 weeks of hunting had led to this moment. Vincent Vinnie Torino's last stronghold, a converted shipping facility where the coward had barricaded himself with his remaining men. Elena positioned herself on the roof of an adjacent building, her rifle scope trained on the main entrance. Through her earpiece she heard Blackwater's voice, calm as death itself. "Remember, lads, Torino is mine. Anyone else who stands in our way—" He left the sentence unfinished, but his meaning was clear. Inside the warehouse, Vinnie paced like a caged animal. His empire had crumbled in mere days. His lieutenants were dead, his money frozen, his reputation in tatters. All because he'd struck some old woman in a moment of rage. How was he supposed to know she was connected to a goddamned pirate? "Boss, maybe we should run," suggested Tommy, one of his last 5 men. "I got a boat." "Run where?" Vinnie snarled. "You seen what this bastard did to Russo. To our operations upstate, there ain't nowhere to run from a ghost." Outside, Blackwater's men moved like shadows. Magnus approached the rear loading dock while Scar and 2 others flanked the building's eastern wall. They'd studied the layout for hours, mapping every entrance, every potential escape route. This wasn't just revenge, it was an execution, planned with surgical precision. The first sign of attack came when the warehouse's power died. Emergency lighting flickered on, casting eerie red shadows across the cavernous space. Vinnie's men raised their weapons, scanning the darkness beyond the loading bays. "He's playing with us," Vinnie muttered, checking his pistol for the 10th time, "trying to spook us before—" The eastern wall exploded inward as Magnus hurled a shipping crate through it with inhuman force. Gunfire erupted immediately, muzzle flashes strobing in the gloom. But the giant wasn't where they expected. He dropped low, using the debris as cover, while he advanced with terrifying speed. 2 of Vinnie's men went down before they could reload. Magnus moved through their positions like a force of nature, his massive frame absorbing impacts that would have killed ordinary men. When Tommy tried to flank him, Scar materialized from the shadows, blade finding its mark between ribs with practiced efficiency. Through the chaos, Blackwater entered through the main doors, walking calmly as battle raged around him. He seemed untouchable, sidestepping gunfire with an almost supernatural awareness. When one gunman lined up a clear shot, Elena's rifle spoke from her distant perch, and the threat vanished. "Torino!" Blackwater's voice cut through the gunfire like a blade. "Come out and face what you've earned." Vinnie had retreated to his makeshift office, a reinforced room he'd hoped would serve as a panic room. But as silence fell over the warehouse, his men's weapons finally quiet, he realized his fortress had become a tomb. The door handle turned slowly. "You killed my boys for nothing," Vinnie said, trying to project bravado he didn't feel. "Over some random old lady I barely touched." Blackwater stepped into the room, his coat unmarked despite the violence he'd walked through. "Random?" His laugh held no warmth. "Margaret Sullivan raised me from nothing, fed me when I was starving, gave me a home when the world had abandoned me. He drew his cutlass, the blade singing as it cleared its sheath. "You struck the only person in this world I've ever called mother." Vinny raised his gun, but Blackwater moved faster than seemed possible. The cutlass carved through air and flesh with equal ease, sending the pistol spinning away along with 2 fingers. Vinny screamed, clutching his ruined hand. "She's just some old broad running a soup kitchen," he gasped. "To you, perhaps." Blackwater's voice remained conversational as he circled his prey. "To me, she's salvation itself. Every meal she serves, every kind word she speaks, that's holiness walking among us mortals." The cutlass found Vinny's shoulder, opening a red line across his collarbone. "And you dared lay hands on her." What followed wasn't a fight. It was an anatomy lesson delivered with surgical precision. Blackwater had promised Margaret he wouldn't kill, and he kept that promise. But there were fates worse than death, and the infamous captain had learned to inflict them with artistic skill. When it ended, Vinny lay broken but breathing, understanding finally that some debts transcended money or territory. The last thing he saw before unconsciousness claimed him was Blackwater standing over him, no satisfaction in his eyes, only the cold completion of duty. Elena's voice crackled through the comm. "Police sirens, 2 minutes out." "Time to go," Blackwater replied, wiping his blade clean. He looked down at Torino one last time. "Live with what you've done, live knowing that mercy came not from my weakness, but from her strength." The dawn broke grey and unforgiving over Millbrook, casting long shadows across the blood-soaked streets. Captain Blackwater stood in the town square, his coat still damp with morning dew and the crimson evidence of the night's work. Around him lay the remnants of Marcus Vega's empire, broken men who had learned too late that some debts could never be forgiven. But Vega himself was nowhere to be found. "Captain," called out Rodriguez, emerging from the burned shell of the warehouse, "we found a hidden passage in the basement, leads to the old mining tunnels beneath the town." Blackwater's jaw tightened. The coward had slipped away like a rat through the sewers while his men died for his sins. "How long of a head start does he have?" "Can't be more than an hour, sir. The blood trail is still fresh." The pirate captain's eyes gleamed with predatory satisfaction. An hour meant nothing when you were dealing with a wounded animal running blind through unfamiliar territory. He'd spent decades hunting men across treacherous waters and hostile lands. These mountain tunnels would be no different than the maze-like caves of Tortuga or the labyrinthine alleys of Port Royal. "Gather the men. We finish this today." Blackwater turned to survey his crew, noting the mixture of exhaustion and bloodlust in their faces. They'd followed him through hell itself to reach this moment, and he wouldn't deny them the satisfaction of seeing justice served complete. The entrance to the mining tunnels lay hidden beneath a false floor in Vega's warehouse, concealed behind stacks of stolen goods and contraband weapons. The passage descended steeply into the mountain's belly, carved roughly from living rock by men long dead. The air grew cold and stale as they moved deeper, their torches casting dancing shadows on the walls. Blackwater led the way, following the sporadic drops of blood that marked Vega's desperate flight. The tunnel branched and twisted, connecting to other passages in a network that had likely taken decades to excavate. But the blood trail never wavered, leading them steadily downward into the mountain's heart. "Sir," whispered Jenkins, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "You hear that?" They all stopped, straining their ears against the oppressive silence. Then it came, the sound of labored breathing and stumbling footsteps somewhere ahead in the darkness. Vega was close, probably fighting exhaustion and blood loss as he struggled through the unfamiliar passages. Blackwater smiled coldly and extinguished his torch, gesturing for his men to do the same. They would hunt him in the dark, the way wolves hunted wounded deer. Sound would be their guide now, and the captain had spent enough time navigating ships through moonless nights to trust his other senses completely. They moved like ghosts through the blackness, following the irregular rhythm of Vega's retreat. The sounds grew closer, more desperate. The man was panicking now, probably realizing that the tunnels weren't the salvation he'd hoped for, but merely a tomb that would hide his body from the world above. A faint light appeared ahead, flickering candlelight that revealed Vega's silhouette pressed against a dead-end wall. He was clawing at the rock with his bare hands, having finally reached a passage that led nowhere. His expensive suit was torn and filthy, dark stains spreading across the fabric from wounds sustained in his flight. "End of the line, Vega." The gangster spun around, his face a mask of terror and rage in the candlelight. He clutched a pistol in his trembling hands, but his aim wavered as he struggled to focus on the shapes emerging from the darkness behind Blackwater. "Stay back!" Vega's voice cracked like a frightened child's. "I'll kill you all, I swear it." Blackwater stepped into the light, his scarred face terrible to behold in the dancing shadows. "You had your chance to die with honor alongside your men. Instead, you chose to run like the coward you've always been. That old woman meant nothing. She was nobody." The words hung in the air like a curse, and Blackwater felt the familiar cold fury wash over him. Even now, cornered like a rat and facing certain death, the man couldn't understand what he'd done wrong. "Her name was Rose Patterson," Blackwater said quietly. "She raised me when no one else would, fed me when I was starving, showed me kindness when the world had shown me nothing but cruelty." Vega's gun hand shook violently as understanding finally dawned in his eyes. You're him, the boy from the orphanage, but you died in the fire." "No." Blackwater drew his cutlass, the steel singing as it cleared the scabbard. "You did." The gunshot echoed through the tunnels, but the bullet went wide as Rodriguez's blade found Vega's wrist. The pistol clattered uselessly to the stone floor as the gangster fell to his knees, clutching his severed hand and screaming. Blackwater raised his cutlass high above his head, thinking of Rose's gentle smile and the warmth of her kitchen on cold winter nights. The warehouse district had fallen silent except for the distant wail of sirens and the rhythmic drip of water from broken pipes. Captain Blackwater moved through the shadows like death itself, her cutlass gleaming in the moonlight that filtered through shattered windows. Behind her, Marcus and Elena flanked wide, their weapons ready as they approached the final stronghold of Victor's crumbling empire. The old fish processing plant loomed ahead, its corrugated metal walls scarred with rust and bullet holes from the night's carnage. Intelligence gathered from Victor's surviving lieutenants had led them here, to where the coward had retreated with his remaining men, thinking concrete walls and automatic weapons would save him from the storm he had unleashed. Blackwater pressed herself against the loading dock, listening to the frantic voices echoing from within. Fear had a particular sound, and she could taste it in the air like copper pennies on her tongue. These weren't the disciplined tones of soldiers preparing for battle. These were the desperate whispers of cornered rats. "Captain," Marcus breathed into his radio, positioned at the building's north entrance. "Thermal shows 8 hostiles, maybe 9. They're clustered in the main processing area." "Copy that." Elena's voice crackled from the south side. "I've got eyes on 2 sentries by the office windows. They're jumpy as hell." Blackwater smiled grimly as she tested the weight of the bolt cutters against the chain securing the main bay door. The irony wasn't lost on her. Viktor Kozlov, who had built his empire on violence and intimidation, was about to learn what real terror felt like. All because he'd struck down a defenseless woman who had been like a mother to Blackwater since she was 15 years old. The chain parted with a soft snap, and the captain eased the heavy door up just enough to slip beneath it. The cavernous interior reeked of old fish and motor oil, punctuated by the sharp stench of cordite from recently fired weapons. Emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red, throwing distorted shadows across abandoned machinery and conveyor belts. She could hear Victor's voice now, sharp and panicked, as he barked orders to his men. "Check every entrance! She's just one woman, for Christ's sake. We have enough firepower to take down an army." But Blackwater wasn't an army. She was something far more dangerous, a force of nature with a singular purpose, unbound by rules of engagement or mercy. She'd learned long ago that the sea respected only 2 things, strength and the willingness to use it without hesitation. Moving between towering metal vats, she signaled her team. Marcus would create a distraction at the north entrance while Elena moved to cut off any escape routes. The plan was simple because simple plans worked. Victor's men would panic, break formation, and in that chaos, justice would find its mark. The first explosion came exactly on schedule, Marcus's flashbang detonating near the office area. Shouts erupted as Victor's men scrambled toward the perceived threat, their muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness like deadly fireflies. In the confusion, Blackwater emerged from behind the machinery like an avenging spirit. Her cutlass found the first man before he even knew she was there, the blade sliding between his ribs with surgical precision. The second turned at his partner's strangled gasp, only to meet the captain's throwing knife in his throat. She retrieved both weapons without breaking stride, her boots silent on the blood-slicked concrete. "She's inside!" someone screamed, but the words were lost in the staccato burst of automatic fire that chewed through empty air where Blackwater had been standing moments before. She was already moving, using the industrial equipment as cover while she systematically dismantled Victor's remaining forces. Elena's rifle spoke from the elevated catwalks, picking off targets with methodical efficiency. Each shot was a prayer answered, another step closer to settling the debt that had brought them all to this blood-soaked reckoning. Through the chaos, Blackwater caught sight of her quarry. Viktor Kozlov crouched behind an overturned desk, his expensive suit torn and stained, his face pale with the kind of terror reserved for men who finally understood that their money and connections meant nothing to the Reaper at their door. Their eyes met across the killing floor, and Blackwater saw the exact moment when Viktor realized who she was. Recognition dawned like sunrise on a drowning man, the understanding that this wasn't random gang violence or a business rival's power play. This was personal. This was justice wearing a human face and carrying a blade that had tasted blood across every ocean on Earth. "You," Viktor whispered, the word barely audible over the gunfire. "You're her, the one Martha raised." Blackwater's smile was winter cold and sharp as broken glass. "I told you some debts can only be paid in blood, Victor, and yours has been accumulating interest for far too long." The final reckoning had come. The harbor at dawn was painted in shades of crimson and gold, the gentle lapping of waves against the pier creating an almost peaceful symphony. Marcus Hawthorne stood at the edge of the dock, his weathered hands gripping the wooden railing as he watched the horizon. The Crimson Vengeance sat anchored in the deeper waters, her black sails furled, waiting like a sleeping predator. Behind him, the town of Millbrook was waking up to a new reality. Word had spread quickly through the narrow streets about what had transpired in the past few days. Tommy the Wrench Castellano's empire had crumbled in spectacular fashion, his lieutenants either dead or fled, his operations dismantled piece by bloody piece. The fear that had gripped the town for years was finally lifting, replaced by something Marcus hadn't seen in these faces for far too long: hope. "Captain," came Sarah's voice from behind him. His first mate approached with measured steps, her boots echoing softly on the weathered planks. "The last of Castellano's safe houses has been cleared. We found ledgers detailing his operations across 3 counties. Local authorities will have enough evidence to clean up what remains of his network." Marcus nodded without turning around. In his coat pocket, he carried a small photograph, faded and creased from years of handling. Martha, with her gentle smile and kind eyes, standing in the garden behind the house where she'd raised him, the house where she'd been struck down by a coward's hand. "And our friend?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. "Secured in the ship's hold. He's been asking for you." Marcus finally turned, his steel-grey eyes catching the morning light. The past week had taken its toll on him, but there was a grim satisfaction in seeing justice served. Every debt had been collected, every account settled, all except one. The walk to his ship felt longer than usual. Townspeople had gathered along the waterfront, some watching from windows, others standing openly on the street. They didn't cheer or wave. This wasn't a celebration. It was a reckoning acknowledged, a debt paid that they hadn't even known was owed. Young Billy Henderson was there, the boy whose grocery store had been terrorized by Castellano's thugs. He caught Marcus's eye and offered a simple nod of gratitude. Beside him stood Mrs. Chen, the seamstress who'd had her shop burned down for refusing to pay protection money. Her establishment would be rebuilt now, funded by the considerable assets Marcus had liberated from Castellano's network. The rowing boat cut smoothly through the calm waters toward the Crimson Vengeance. Marcus's crew lined the rails, their faces bearing the satisfied expressions of men who had served justice rather than mere vengeance. These weren't bloodthirsty pirates. They were instruments of retribution, and they knew the difference. Below deck, the air was thick and stifling. Tommy Castellano sat chained in the ship's hold, his expensive suit torn and stained, his face bearing the marks of his capture. The arrogance that had defined him was gone, replaced by the desperate fear of a man who finally understood the magnitude of his mistake. "You should have left her alone, Tommy." Marcus's voice was quiet, almost conversational. "That's all you had to do, leave one old woman in peace." Castellano looked up, his eyes bloodshot and wild. "I didn't know who she was to you. How could I have known?" "That's exactly the point." Marcus crouched down, bringing himself to eye level with the trembling man. "You hurt her because you thought she was nobody, because you thought there would be no consequences, because you believed you could destroy something beautiful and pure without anyone caring enough to make you pay." The ship rocked gently as Marcus stood. Through the porthole, Millbrook was visible in the distance, its buildings catching the strengthening sunlight. "Martha Hawthorne was a saint walking among us," Marcus continued. "She fed the hungry, comforted the grieving, and showed kindness to everyone she met. She saved me from a life on the streets, gave me purpose, taught me that there was still good in this world worth protecting." Castellano's voice cracked. "What do you want? Money? I can pay you more than—" "There isn't enough money in all the world, Tommy." Marcus turned toward the ladder leading back to the upper deck. His business here was finished. The decision had been made the moment Castellano raised his hand against Martha. "Captain!" Castellano's voice rose to a desperate shriek. "Please, I have information, other operations, other criminals you could hunt down." Marcus paused, one foot on the ladder's first rung. "The world will judge them as they've judged themselves. But you?" He looked back one final time. "You struck down an angel, and angels, Tommy, are under my protection." The sound of his boots on the wooden ladder echoed in the hold as Marcus climbed toward the light, leaving Tommy Castellano alone with the weight of his sins and the tide that was slowly beginning to rise through the ship's opened sea valves. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone square where it had all begun 3 weeks ago. Captain Elias Blackwater stood at the exact spot where Martha Whitmore had fallen, her frail body crumpling under Tommy Briggs' cowardly blow. The blood had long since been scrubbed away, but he could still see it there, dark against the stones. The town of Millhaven stirred to life around him. Shopkeepers opened their doors, children ran toward the schoolhouse, and fishermen prepared their nets for the day's work. None of them knew that their quiet coastal village had become the epicenter of a reckoning that would be whispered about in taverns across 3 continents. Martha emerged from the bakery, moving slowly but steadily on her walking stick. Her bruises had faded to yellow patches, and the spark had returned to her weathered eyes. She spotted him immediately and made her way over, ignoring the concerned glances from passers-by who still wasn't sure what to make of the infamous pirate captain who'd taken up temporary residence in their midst. "You're leaving today," she said. It wasn't a question. Blackwater nodded, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. "My crew grows restless. The Crimson Revenge wasn't meant for peaceful harbors." Martha studied his face with a keen perception that had made her the town's unofficial moral compass for 73 years. "And Tommy Briggs?" A ghost of a smile played at the corner of Blackwater's mouth. "Let's just say his new employers in the coal mines of Tasmania appreciate workers who don't ask questions about working conditions or pay." She chuckled, a sound like autumn leaves rustling. "Indentured servitude." Your grandmother would have approved of the poetry in that." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the town wake up around them. Blackwater had spent weeks learning every face, every routine, every small kindness that made Millhaven more than just another port on his charts. He'd discovered that Mrs. Chen always saved day-old bread for the stray dogs. That young Peter Morrison worked 2 jobs to support his widowed mother, that the blacksmith never charged full price for horseshoes when times were lean. "You know," Martha said carefully, "there's always room for one more in a town like this, for a man who's tired of running from his past." Blackwater's expression darkened slightly. "The past has a way of following men like me, Martha. I won't bring that shadow to your doorstep. And what if that shadow finds its way here regardless? What if Millhaven needs someone who knows how to stand against it?" Before he could answer, First Mate Rodriguez appeared at the edge of the square, touching his hat respectfully to Martha. "Captain, the tide turns in an hour. The crew's aboard and ready." Blackwater nodded but didn't move immediately. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather pouch, pressing it into Martha's hands despite her protests. "For the church roof," he said firmly, "and the new school books, and whatever else this town needs." Martha hefted the pouch, her eyes widening slightly at its weight. "This is too much." "It's exactly enough." He turned to face her fully, his voice dropping to a tone reserved for sacred oaths. "My grandmother's spirit can rest now. The debt is paid." "The debt was paid when you ran Tommy out of town," Martha replied. This is something else entirely." Rodriguez cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Captain, the harbour master's asking about port fees." "Tell him they're waived," Martha said quickly. "The town council voted on it this morning, unanimously." A genuine smile broke across Blackwater's features, transforming his scarred face completely. For a moment, Martha could see the young man he'd been before the world had carved its harsh lessons into his flesh and soul. "Then I suppose this isn't goodbye forever," he said. "The Crimson Revenge will always have safe harbour here," Martha confirmed, "and its captain will always have a place at my dinner table, should he choose to claim it." They shook hands formally, the elderly woman's grip surprisingly strong against the pirate's calloused palm. Then, to Rodriguez's obvious surprise, Blackwater bent slightly and kissed Martha's cheek with the courtly grace of a bygone era. "Until the winds bring me home again," he murmured. As he strode toward the harbour, his coat billowing behind him in the morning breeze, Martha called out one final time, "Elias!" He turned back. "Your grandmother would be proud of the man you've become." He touched 2 fingers to his forehead in salute, then disappeared into the crowd of mourning merchants and fishermen heading toward the docks. Martha remained in the square long after the Crimson Revenge had cleared the harbour, its black sails catching the wind as it headed toward the horizon. She knew, with the certainty that comes from a lifetime of reading people's hearts, that she would see Captain Elias Blackwater again. Some debts, after all, could only be paid in loyalty.